Over the past 2 decades, the Blue Devils have had an unprecedented history of success in the activity, winning 10 championships, 6 of which were undefeated seasons. And to put that into perspective, in the past 14 seasons alone, only 5 other cores have taken the title, with the Blue Devils winning the other 9. And there was even a point where the Blue Devils didn't lose a single show for an entire 2 years. But with all the success, there's been a growing community of people that are just tired of seeing the Blue Devils win. And it makes sense too, because the activity as a whole can become stale from a competitive standpoint when there's only one group winning all the time. But as the activity has grown through the years, and with the introduction of social media over the past 6 or 7 years, I've started to notice more and more of a narrative about who the Blue Devils really are and why they win. Now, full disclaimer, I marched with the Blue Devils for 4 years, and I've always been a fan of BD. But I want to try to look at this from as much of an objective point of view as I can to take a deeper look into where all of this anti-Blue Devil sentiment comes from. But at the end of the day, we gotta remember that drum corps really is just art, and everyone's entitled to like and dislike what they want. But that being said, let's get into it. One of the oldest arguments in the Blue Devils hater handbook is the park and bark. If you don't know what that means, it's basically saying that the Blue Devils just stand still and play loud. And that's why they win. That's why they're good at brass. And people say this all the time, and really confidently too. Basically implying that the Blue Devils brass is only good because they don't have any visual demand on top of their musical demand. So let's look at some actual numbers here. I went ahead and sat through the top 4 shows all the way through with a timer to see just how much marching and playing that the cores are actually doing. And we're talking marching and playing, not just standing still while doing visuals while playing. That doesn't count. And here are the numbers. The Boston Crusaders were moving for roughly 2 minutes and 49 seconds. Carolina Crown was moving and playing for 3 minutes and 8 seconds. The Blue Devils were moving and playing for 4 minutes and 3 seconds. And the Bluecoats were moving and playing for 4 minutes and 46 seconds. So these are rough numbers. I know this is not a science to this, it's just me with a timer. But looking at these numbers, I don't know if this is a valid statement. I mean, sure, for the most difficult parts of their repertoire, the Blue Devils are standing still to play those really hard parts and doing some visuals while they do it. But that's mostly every single core when they have their hardest part of their book. But the fact remains that the Blue Devils are playing and moving a substantial amount, and the Bluecoats even more so. And I think they should get credit for that. Okay, let's get one thing right off the bat. The Blue Devils do not pay the judges. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that the majority of the people that are saying this online are just trolling, but I see it so often that I just want to make it clear. If you think that the Blue Devils bribe judges to win, then you need to understand how ridiculous that actually is. On finals night, there are 11 judges on the panel, and all of their scores independently are added together to create the final score. So are the Blue Devils bribing all 11 of the judges to come together and figure out how to calculate their scores so that BD comes just on top year after year? Besides all that, you have to understand that the DCI educator community is extremely connected. Everyone knows everyone. And if you think that other staff from Carolina Crown or the Bluecoats would just be okay with this bribery that's happening from the Blue Devils, that's just absurd. A somewhat more realistic criticism is that the judges in the activity are alumni of the Blue Devils, and therefore they have a bias towards the Blue Devils. So let's look at the judging panel from last year's finals night. From what I could find, none of them had ever marched or taught at the Blue Devils. They did, however, at the Madison Scouts, Spirit of Atlanta, Glassman, Santa Clara Vanguard, Boston Crusaders, and the Cadets. But even then, people will say, oh, Blue Devils just designs their shows to win, or they design their shows for the judges and not for audiences to enjoy. When I was marching at the Blue Devils, I heard this a lot, and I honestly didn't really understand why. Because when you're out there actually learning the show in the preseason with the staff, you're just in awe of the design staff and how they just kind of craft us and experiment with us to try new things and move us around. The whole design process of the Blue Devils is one of my favorite parts about the Blue Devils experience, because it's really unique in the sense that there's no dot books, there's no drill books, there's no drill sheets, there's nothing like that. It's super organic and super fluid, and I think that truly is the essence of creativity within this activity. But back to the point, I think it's just a little weird that people would assume that the Blue Devils staff early season just sits down at a table and decides the goal this year is to win, and less so to make a show that's great. And I think a lot of it has to do with how Blue Devils shows resonate with audiences, because it's not a secret that Blue Devils shows are less crowd-pleasing than, say, Crown or Bluecoats. but that doesn't mean they're only designed to win or they're lacking creativity or innovation. Take 2012 Blue Devils, for example. That show was not that likable from the average audience perspective. It's very dissonant and very abstract and just weird sometimes. But that show is incredibly good. It's so visually innovative and musically challenging and just generally captivating. So is that what makes a show designed for the judges when it's just not as easily accessible to the average audience member? If so, then I think the Blue Devils are guilty of that. But they don't do it for the judges. They do it because they create the art that they want to create. In tandem with this idea that the Blue Devils bribe judges is the idea that Blue Devils have so much money that they can just buy their way to success through expensive props and tech or a luxurious housing site or a well-paid staff. And honestly, this isn't completely untrue in my opinion. The cost of drum corps continues to rise year after year to a point where the way that drum corps is now, it won't be sustainable. And I don't know the behind-the-scenes financial details of the Blue Devils organization, but I do know that my tours with Blue Devils were considerably more comfortable than with other tours. I think a lot of that has to do with just good management and more sleep, honestly. But it is true that the Blue Devils get to stay at a hotel during finals week, and we stay at the occasional dorm instead of sleeping on the gym floor. And I'm pretty sure a lot of the organization's money comes from the bingo hall that they have in Northern California and their company System Blue, which also holds educational events and produces System Blue instruments. But this idea that Blue Devils pays for this golden carpet to be laid out in front of them that leads them to success every year is just not true. I'm sure every drum corps struggles with a financial toll that grows year after year, including the Blue Devils. But looking at it from a purely competitive standpoint, I don't think that it affects the top 5 as much as it does the rest of the lower end of the spectrum. But I do think that having good financial standings makes tour smoother, and when tour's smoother, you get stuff done faster. That's just the truth. So there is an advantage there for sure. The most common criticism that I hear today about the Blue Devils is that their show is the same. That year after year they just do the same show over and over, Metamorph Part 17. And I've asked a lot of people who've had this opinion about what specifically they think is the same year after year. And surprisingly, a lot of them just admit that they don't have a specific reason, and it's more about the vibe and the feel year after year. It just feels the same. But let's try to analyze what exactly makes people feel this way. So let's go over some of the common criticisms. The Blue Devils uniform. It looks the same year after year. But I think what's important to remember is that the Blue Devils want to look like the Blue Devils. I personally like that when they walk onto the field, you can immediately tell that they are the Blue Devils. And I do appreciate when other corps completely change up their whole look for their show concept, but I think both approaches can be good at the same time. A lot of people also say that the Blue Devils do the same visuals year after year, and I think that's true, but it's part of the corps' identity, just like the Phantom leg kick or the Cadets Z-pull. But a big one is that the Blue Devils repeats the same music over and over again, or same sounding music. And yeah, they do. Sometimes it's literally the same exact music note for note. I mean, in the drumline, they've used some long passages that are note for note exactly the same. But I do think it can be intentional and a way to kind of create some sort of rhythmic identity for the corps. But BD is definitely guilty of using old show repertoire in new shows. And to be honest, I personally kind of agree that we don't really need to hear this anymore. Take 2018 and even this season, for example. I think there can be some rare occasions where it makes sense in the show concept to repeat music from the past, like in 2017, where the show was about the metamorphosis of the drum corps activity and you heard, echoes from the past throughout the show. But personally, I think there's just so much music out there that we don't need to hear the same exact piece of music being played by the same corps, even if it was 10 years ago. But I think a lot of this criticism of repetitiveness actually has to do with the structure of the show. Like pretty much all of the marching activity, there's an opener, ballad, and a closer. The opener usually being up-tempo with some big opening hit, and then the ballad being more slowed down and musically intimate, and then the closer bringing up the tempo again and ending with a bang. And yes, the Blue Devils does follow their version of this formula year after year. But then, so do a lot of other cores too. Let's take Carolina Crown for example. Since around 2013, Crown has typically started their show with an intro that leads into a huge brass hit that's like almost like a finale, and at the end of the show they usually reprise this opening hit to close out the show. Here are some examples. Another example of this kind of thing is from the Bluecoats. Usually in the middle of their show they'll have some polyrhythmic section where it'll start in a triplet feel and then slowly transform into this duple feel, or vice versa, and it's become sort of this identity or sound that you expect from the Bluecoats year after year. Now, what is something that the Blue Devils do year after year? A good example, I think, is the ballad Blob hit. Since back in like 2017, the Blue Devils have typically had a big ballad hit where all the brass kind of munge together and then there's a big guard feature on the other side of the field. So I don't bring up Carolina Crown and the Bluecoats to be like pointing fingers at them to say, hey, they do it too. I think what they do is great, and I actually don't have a problem with them repeating these things year after year. But my point is that these formulas are used across the entire activity. It's just part of the activity, and I don't necessarily think that it inherently limits the creativity of these course shows year after year. So does BD deserve all this criticism? I think there is very valid criticism, but if you are one of those people that thinks Blue Devils pays the judges or that they have the same exact show year after year, I hope this gives you something a little bit more to think about when it comes to their shows. And I know most of these BD haters are just kids that are either trolling or that are just tired of seeing them win. But you know what? If you just don't like the Blue Devils because you're tired of seeing them win, that's fine. Just be honest about it. Anyways, thanks guys for watching. I know this is not like the typical content that you see on this channel, but I appreciate you guys watching all the way through, and if you have some thoughts about this, leave it in the comments below. Also, I don't speak on behalf of the Blue Devils organization at all whatsoever. Okay, these are just my thoughts as someone who has been in the activity and someone who just kind of sees it online, and I just wanted to talk about it a little more because I think it's interesting. But yeah, thanks guys for watching, and if you have any other topics that you'd want me to rant about, just let me know in the comments. Peace.